There are stories hidden in every archive, but some boxes were never meant to be opened. Storage Room C at Capitol Records was one of those places, a forgotten vault of dust, silence, and ghosts. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in September 2007 when Thomas Chen, one of the last true audio archivists, pulled down a cardboard box that hadn't been touched since the early 1960s. The label was wrong. It wasn't typed. It wasn't official. Just a strip of old masking tape with 4 words scribbled in ballpoint pen. FS, Private Sessions, Do Not Catalog. Thomas froze. He knew every Sinatra session number, every master reel, every vault log entry. But this reel, this one wasn't supposed to exist. Inside the box were 3 7-inch tapes. 2 had proper labels, take numbers, song titles, dates, ordinary history. But the third, wrapped in brittle brown paper, had only 2 lines written on a yellowed scrap of notepaper. The first, unmistakably in Frank Sinatra's own handwriting, personal, not for release, FS. The second line, in a nervous engineer's pencil, recorded February 14, 1960, 2:30 a.m., destroy after playback per FS instruction. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. A tape Frank Sinatra ordered destroyed, still here, still intact, still waiting. His hands trembled as he held the reel up to the fluorescent light. The magnetic tape inside, brown, delicate, perfectly preserved, had survived 5 decades of silence. He shouldn't play it. He knew that. The note was clear. Sinatra had made his wishes clear. But archivists are built differently. They are guardians of what history tries to hide. In the corner of the room sat a restored Studer reel-to-reel machine, a beautiful Swiss relic from the 1960s. Thomas had rebuilt it himself. He trusted it more than he trusted people. He threaded the tape with reverence, like a priest preparing a relic. Left reel, across the playback head, around the capstan, onto the take-up reel. He powered on the machine. The reels began to turn. A soft hiss filled the room, the sound of time itself waking up. Leader tape passed. Silence. Then, a breath, a cigarette lighter, a low, weary exhale, and then a voice that stopped the world for half a century. February 14th, 1960, 2:30 in the morning. Nobody here but me and Bill on piano. This is just for me. The piano answered, a slow, mournful D minor progression, and then Frank Sinatra began to sing. Thomas stopped breathing. He was alone in a forgotten storage room, listening to a man who'd been dead for a decade, a man who never wanted this recording to survive. What could Frank Sinatra have recorded that he never wanted the world to hear? February 14th, 1960. Valentine's Day. Capitol Records, Studio A, Hollywood. The session had officially ended at midnight. The orchestra had packed up, 30 musicians, their music stands, their instruments, their cigarettes and coffee cups. The arrangers and conductors had left. The engineers had logged the final takes, made their notes, prepared to archive the master tapes. It had been a good session. Professional. Clean. They'd recorded 3 songs for Frank's upcoming album, standards, swing numbers, the kind of material Capitol Records paid for. The kind of material Frank Sinatra, at 44 years old, could deliver in his sleep. But sleep wasn't coming tonight. Frank stood alone on the recording floor, still wearing his dress shirt and loosened tie. His jacket hung over a chair. An ashtray balanced on the piano lid, already full. A bottle of Jack Daniels sat on the control room console, 1/3 empty. Studio A was different at this hour. During the day, it was all business. Bright lights, union rules, executives in the booth, everyone watching the clock. But after midnight, With only the red recording light casting its glow, the studio became something else. A confessional, a cave, a place where sounds could hide. Frank walked to the control room window and tapped on the glass. Inside, Bill Miller, his longtime pianist and closest musical confidant, looked up from the piano bench. "Bill, you got another hour in you?" Bill glanced at the wall clock. 2:15 a.m. They both had other sessions in the morning, but something in Frank's voice made him nod. "Always got time for you, boss." "Good. Send everyone else home, just you and me, and keep the tape rolling." The engineer, a young guy named David who'd worked with Frank maybe 3 times, started to protest. "Mr. Sinatra, we're not logged for additional session time. Union says—" Frank's look silenced him. Not angry, just tired, infinitely tired. "I'll pay the overtime myself, you, Bill, and whatever the tape costs, but I need you to do something for me." "What's that, Mr. Sinatra?" "When we're done, I need you to destroy this tape. Not file it, not archive it, erase it. Understand?" David looked confused. "Why would you want to destroy?" "Because what I'm about to record isn't for Columbia Records or Capitol Records or the radio or anybody's jukebox. It's just something I need to get out, and then I need it gone. Can you do that?" David nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now hit record." Frank walked back to the vocal microphone. It was a Neumann U47, warm, intimate, the kind of microphone that captured every breath, every subtle crack in the voice. He didn't have sheet music, didn't have a title, didn't have anything prepared. He just stood there, lit another cigarette, and spoke into the microphone. "February 14th, 1960, 2:30 in the morning. Nobody here but me and Bill on piano. This is just for me. This stays here." He glanced at Bill through the glass, made a gesture. "Just follow me." Bill's hands found the keys, D minor, slow, mournful, the kind of progression you play at 3 a.m. when you're alone with regrets. And Frank began to sing. Not performing, not entertaining, just releasing something that had been building inside him for years. The song, if you could call it a song, wasn't anything Capitol Records would have released. It wasn't swing, wasn't a ballad in the traditional sense. It was something raw, more broken. Frank's voice, usually so controlled and precise, was different here. It cracked on certain words, wavered on sustained notes. Sometimes he almost spoke instead of sang, his voice dropping into a whisper that the U47 captured perfectly. The lyrics, if David the engineer had written them down, they would have seemed incomplete, fragments, images without clear narrative. "And the telephone rings, but I let it die. Your face in the mirror, 44 years old. Sorry doesn't cover what I took from you. If I could go back to when it all still meant something." He sang about a woman without naming her, about children without saying how many, about fame like it was a prison sentence. Bill Miller, accompanying on piano, kept his playing minimal. Just chords, space, letting Frank's voice carry all the weight. At one point, Frank stopped mid-phrase. Just stopped. Stood there silent for 10 seconds while the tape kept rolling. Then he spoke into the microphone, his voice rough. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing, Bill." Bill's voice came through the studio speakers, gentle. "You're telling the truth, Frank. Keep going." And he did. The song, or confession, or prayer, or whatever it was, lasted 7 minutes, an eternity in recording terms. No radio station would play 7 minutes of Frank Sinatra's voice cracking over a minor key piano, but that wasn't the point. Near the end, Frank sang a line that made David, the engineer, close his eyes. "And if there's anyone listening, anyone at all, forgive me." The piano held a final chord, let it ring out, decay into silence. Frank stood at the microphone for a long moment, head down, breathing. Then he walked into the control room without a word. To understand what Frank Sinatra recorded that night, you have to understand what led him to that microphone at 2:30 a.m. on Valentine's Day, 1960. February 1960 was a strange time in Frank's life. Professionally, he was at a peak. His Capitol Records albums were critically acclaimed, his concert tours sold out, he'd won an Oscar for From Here to Eternity. He was making movies with the Rat Pack. He was, by all external measures, on top of the world. But internally, Frank was unraveling. His marriage to Ava Gardner had officially ended years ago, but the wound had never healed. Ava was the one who got away, the one he couldn't control, the one who'd seen through the swagger and the fame to the scared kid from Hoboken underneath. And that scared kid was still there, 44 years old, looking in the mirror and seeing someone he didn't fully recognize. Frank's relationship with his children from his first marriage, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., and Tina, was complicated. He loved them fiercely, but he'd also chosen fame over them, chosen Ava over them, chosen himself over them. And the guilt of that aided him in quiet moments. There were the mob connections, real friendships with dangerous people that the FBI was very interested in. There was the drinking, the temper, the fights with journalists, the growing sense that the world he'd helped create, celebrity culture, Vegas, the Rat Pack lifestyle, was hollow at its core. But the specific trigger for that night? That came earlier in the day. Frank had received a phone call that afternoon from Nancy Jr., his oldest daughter. She was 19, beautiful, starting her own singing career. She'd called to tell him she was getting serious with someone, a boy Frank hadn't met, a boy who was taking his little girl away. The conversation had been fine, polite. Nancy was happy. But after Frank hung up, something broke inside him. Not because he disapproved of the boy, but because he realized Nancy was grown, his children were grown, and he'd missed it. He'd been so busy being Frank Sinatra, recording, performing, conquering, that he'd looked up one day and his kids were adults, and they'd grown up without him. That realization, combined with the date, Valentine's Day, the holiday for lovers, and Frank hadn't had real love in years, created a pressure inside him that couldn't be relieved by another drink or another performance. It could only be relieved by saying, out loud, into a microphone, the things he'd never said to anyone. So he went to the studio. He sent everyone away except Bill Miller, and he recorded the truth. After the final note faded, the studio was silent for a long time. David, the engineer, sat frozen at the console, his hand still on the record level meter. Bill Miller remained at the piano, not moving. Frank stood in the control room, staring at the tape machine as it continued to roll, recording silence now. "Play it back," Frank said quietly. David rewound the tape. The reels spun backward, creating that distinctive reverse playback sound. When he reached the beginning, he hit play, and Frank Sinatra listened to himself. The glow of the VU meters, the soft mechanical sound of tape moving past the playback head, and his own voice, captured at 2:30 a.m., saying things he'd never said before. At first, Frank's expression was neutral, controlled, the face he showed the world. But as the recording progressed, something changed. He heard the way his voice cracked on certain lines, heard the vulnerability, the raw, unguarded emotion, heard himself almost breaking down mid-song. This was not Frank Sinatra the legend. This was Francis Albert, Dolly Sinatra's son, scared and lost and 44 years old. When the playback finished, the silence in the control room was suffocating. Bill Miller spoke first, his voice careful. "Frank, that might be the most honest thing you've ever recorded." Frank's jaw tightened, which is exactly why nobody can ever hear it. David looked confused. "But Mr. Sinatra, this is private." Frank's voice was sharp now, controlled, dangerous. "This is not for the album, not for the archives, not for anybody." But the tape quality is perfect. The performance is, I don't care about the performance, kid. I care that I just put my guts on tape and I need them off. Frank walked to the tape machine, put his hand on the reel, feeling its weight. I want this destroyed, tonight, before you leave this building. Erase it, cut it up, burn it. I don't care, but it cannot exist. Bill Miller stood up from the piano bench. Frank, I understand wanting to protect yourself, but what you just did, people spend their whole lives trying to be that honest. Destroying it seems... I don't need a lecture, Bill. Frank's voice was tired now. I needed to say it out loud. I said it. Now I need it gone. He looked at David. Can you do that, or do I need to do it myself? David nodded slowly. I can do it, Mr. Sinatra. Good. I'm leaving. Bill, you're my witness. Make sure this tape doesn't walk out of here. Frank grabbed his jacket, his cigarettes, and walked toward the studio door. But before he left, he turned back, looked at the tape machine one more time. Maybe in another life, he said quietly, I could have been the kind of man who could say these things sober, in daylight, to the people I hurt. But I'm not. So this is all I got. And even this is too much. The heavy studio door closed behind him with a soft thud. Bill and David sat in silence. Finally, Bill spoke. You gonna destroy it? David looked at the tape, at the 7 minutes of Frank Sinatra's soul captured on magnetic ribbon. He told me to. That's not what I asked. David ran his hair through his hair. If I destroy it, the most honest moment of Frank Sinatra's life disappears. Nobody ever knows it existed. That feels wrong. And if you don't destroy it? Then I'm disobeying a direct order from Frank Sinatra. Also wrong. Bill stood up. I'm going home. I was never here. You do what you think is right, kid. But know this, whatever you decide, you're going to have to live with it for the rest of your life. Bill left. David sat alone in the control room with the tape. He stared at it for a long time. Then he did something he'd later questioned for decades. He made a safety copy, a second reel recorded in real time from the master. Standard engineering practice, always make a backup. Then he took the master reel, the one Frank had touched, the one with his handwritten note, and he carefully erased it, recorded over it with silence, turned Frank's confession into blank tape. But the safety copy, that David wrapped in brown paper, placed in an unmarked box, and hid on a high shelf in storage room C, where it would sit, untouched, for 47 years. The next morning, Frank Sinatra called the studio. It's done, David told him. The tape is erased. You're sure? I erased it myself. It's gone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Good, Frank said finally. Thank you. Mr. Sinatra? Yeah? For what it's worth, I understand why you wanted it destroyed. But what you recorded last night, that took more courage than any performance you've ever given. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, courage is keeping your mouth shut when you should, not opening it when you shouldn't. Goodbye, kid. The line went dead. David hung up and stared at the phone. In his pocket was the key to storage room C. In that room, on a high shelf, was a box with a copy of the tape that wasn't supposed to exist. David told himself he'd destroy it later, when he could bring himself to do it. But later never came. Time passed. Frank Sinatra's career continued its trajectory. More albums, more concerts, more movies. He formed Reprise Records and gained total artistic control over his music. He became chairman of the board. The legend grew. But among certain people in Frank's inner circle, musicians, engineers, arrangers, there was a whispered story. The story of the Valentine's tape. The session that happened after midnight. The song Frank recorded and destroyed. The moment when Frank Sinatra, who never showed weakness, broke. Bill Miller never spoke about it publicly, but late at night, after a few drinks, he'd sometimes say to trusted friends, "I heard Frank at his most honest once. Nobody else ever will." Nelson Riddle, Frank's legendary arranger, once mentioned in an interview, never published, that Frank had recorded something in 1960 that he believed was the real Frank, the one he never let anyone see. Count Basie, after a Carnegie Hall concert in 1975, was asked by a young journalist about Frank's genius. Basie said, "Frank's genius is that he never lets you hear him weak. But I heard a story once about a tape where he did. If that tape still exists, that's the real legacy." But the tape was gone, destroyed, lost to history. Or so everyone believed. David, the engineer, had left Capitol Records in 1963 to work in television. He'd never told anyone about the safety copy, not his wife, not his children. It was a secret he carried like a stone in his pocket. Sometimes, late at night, he'd think about it. Think about driving to Capitol Records, retrieving the box, and finally destroying the tape like Frank had wanted. But he never did, because deep down, David believed that what Frank had recorded that night was too important to erase, even if Frank himself couldn't see it. Even if the world never heard it, David wanted it to exist, somewhere, as evidence that Frank Sinatra, beneath all the swagger and the fame, was human. September 2007. Storage Room C. Thomas Chen, alone with the tape machine. The recording continued. Thomas sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as Frank Sinatra's voice filled the small room. It was everything the legends had hinted at. Raw, broken, honest. The voice cracked. The lyrics were incomplete. The performance was imperfect. And it was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever heard. When the tape ended, 7 minutes and 43 seconds after it began, Thomas sat in silence. His first instinct was to call someone. His supervisor, a music historian, the Sinatra estate. This was important. This was history. But then he thought about the note. Destroy after playback per FS instruction. Frank had wanted this destroyed, had specifically ordered it. This wasn't a lost recording. It was a deliberately hidden one. Thomas rewound the tape, listened again, and again. Each time he heard something new, a lyric he'd missed, a breath, a pause that said more than words. He thought about David, the engineer who'd made this copy, who disobeyed Frank's order because he believed this recording mattered. Was David right, or was he wrong? Thomas looked at the tape, spinning slowly on the machine. If he reported this discovery, it would be analyzed, documented, possibly released. Frank Sinatra's most private moment would become public property. Music critics would dissect it, fans would debate it, someone would upload it to YouTube and it would get 10 million views, and Frank would hate that. But if Thomas destroyed it, honored Frank's original intention, the world would lose something irreplaceable. A window into the soul of one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Thomas sat with this dilemma for a long time. Finally, he made a decision. He carefully removed the tape from the machine, placed it back in its brown paper wrapping, put it back in the unmarked box. Then he wrote a note, attached it to the box. Recorded February 14, 1960. Frank Sinatra, vocal. Bill Miller, piano. Recorded at subject's request as a private session. Subject ordered tape destroyed, but a safety copy survived. Contents: 7 minutes, 43 seconds of deeply personal material, not for public release. Preserved as historical documentation, but restricted from access per subject's intent. Recommendation: seal for 50 years from subject's death. 2048. T. Chen, Capitol Records Archive, September 2007. Thomas placed the box back on the high shelf, where it would remain, documented but hidden, until 2048. By then, everyone who knew Frank personally would be gone. The people he might have hurt with this recording would be gone. And maybe then, the world could hear Frank Sinatra telling the truth without it feeling like a violation. Thomas turned off the tape machine, turned off the lights, locked the door to storage room C, and carried the secret with him, just as David had carried it. Just as Frank himself had carried so many secrets. There's a tape somewhere in the Capitol Records archive, hidden, documented but sealed, waiting for a date when everyone involved is long gone. On that tape is 7 minutes and 43 seconds of Frank Sinatra at his most vulnerable, his most human, his most real. Frank Sinatra wanted that tape destroyed because he understood something that most of us only learn through painful experience. The parts of ourselves we most want to hide are often the truest parts. The perfect performance is a lie. The polished image is a construction. But the moment when the mask slips, when we stand in front of a microphone at 2:30 a.m. and say the things we've never said out loud, that's when we're finally honest. Frank spent his entire career crafting an image, the confident crooner, the swinging bachelor, the chairman of the board, and he did it brilliantly. That image made him a legend. But legends aren't human. They don't crack. They don't break. They don't stand in dark studios and confess their failures. Frank knew that if the world heard that tape, they'd see past the legend. They'd see Francis Albert, the scared kid, the failed husband, the absent father, the man who'd chosen fame over everything else and was finally realizing what that choice had cost him. And Frank couldn't let that happen. Because once the image cracks, it never fully repairs. Once people see your weakness, they can't unsee it. So he ordered the tape destroyed, tried to erase the moment when he told the truth. But here's what Frank didn't understand, or maybe he did and that's why it scared him. That moment of truth was worth more than 1,000 perfect performances. Every person carries secrets. Every person has a version of themselves they try to destroy. The angry one, the scared one, the lonely one, the one who made all the wrong choices. We try to erase those versions, pretend they don't exist, show the world only our polished selves. But those hidden versions, those are the ones that matter. Those are the ones that make us human. Those are the ones that, if we're brave enough, we might someday record, speak out loud, admit. Frank Sinatra was many things: singer, actor, legend, icon. But on February 14, 1960, at 2:30 in the morning, he was something rarer. He was honest. And even though he tried to destroy that honesty, it survived, hidden, waiting. A testament to the fact that truth, no matter how hard we try, doesn't erase. Somewhere in a dark archive, a tape is spinning. Not for audiences, not for critics, not for history books. Just spinning. Holding the sound of a man finally telling the truth, then trying to bury it. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the songs that made him famous, but the one song he recorded for himself. The one he couldn't face, the one that shows us what it costs to be a legend. Everything, including the right to be human. If you're listening to this story, you might be asking, should that tape ever be heard? Frank said no, he wanted it destroyed. His wishes seem clear. But what about the tape's truth? What about the moment of honesty it captures? Does art belong to the artist or to history? These questions don't have simple answers. What we can say is this: Frank Sinatra gave us hundreds of recordings, Decades of music, countless performances where he was perfect, polished, the legend we wanted him to be. Maybe we don't need to hear him broken. Maybe it's enough to know that he was, that beneath the swagger and the songs there was a man who hurt, who regretted, who stood alone in a studio and confessed. Maybe respecting Frank's wish, keeping that tape sealed, that moment private, is the final gift we can give him. Because in the end, Frank Sinatra wasn't just a voice, he was a person. And people deserve the right to their secrets, even if those secrets could break your heart.